The one physician present at both Parkland Hospital and the Bethesda morgue was George Berkeley, Kennedy's personal doctor. Like Knudsen, he was a Navy officer, and as a rear admiral, he ranked above him. Berkeley signed the autopsy descriptive sheet with a bullet in the back at the level of T3. And he also signed Kennedy's death certificate, which also placed that wound in the back. That death certificate is not in the Warren Commission volumes, and the descriptive sheet in the Commission volumes does not have Berkeley's signature. Our inspector did not depose George Berkeley, but Berkeley went further than that.
Dr. Berkeley told me it's a simple matter, Tom, of a bullet right through the head.
Dr. Berkeley did an interview with the JFK Library in 1967 and was asked this question.
Do you agree with the Warren report on the number of bullets that entered the president's body?
I would not care to be quoted on that.
In 1977, through his lawyer, he wrote a letter to Richard Sprague, chief counsel of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He said he had information indicating that others besides Oswald must have participated in the assassination. He was willing to talk about it at this time. Sprague, who made clear his intention to fully investigate the CIA's involvement, was forced out 2 weeks later. Dr. Berkeley submitted a written statement to the House Select Committee, but there is no official record of him being deposed as a witness.
In 1982, he told JFK researcher Henry Hurt, I know there was more than one gunman. And when Henry Hurt tried to recontact Berkeley for more details, Berkeley cut him off at the knees. I don't want to talk about it anymore. The very next year, Berkeley talked to Michael Kurtz, another JFK researcher, told him that he knew there was a conspiracy to kill the president and that he recalled an exit wound in the back of President Kennedy's head. Now, that's a very significant statement, that the only doctor we know of who was present at both Parkland for treatment and at Bethesda during the autopsy told Michael Kurtz in 1983 that Kennedy had an exit wound in the back of his head. When Kurtz tried to recontact Berkeley, Berkeley cut him off at the knees. I don't want to talk about this anymore. Dr. Berkeley was deceased by the time the review board was impaneled. So then Jeremy decided, well, we can ask the executor of his estate, his daughter, to sign a waiver so that we could go to the law firm that Mr. Illig used to work for, because he was deceased also, and see if there were any records in the file of Mr. Illig that would have revealed what it was he wanted to tell the HSCA in detail. And she said she would do that. And then Jeremy called her on the phone. She had completely changed her mind and adamantly refused to sign it and terminated the phone call.
When I was a teenager, Dr. Berkeley and his family, 4 children, and my father and our family of 4 children shared a duplex, lived together at the Newport Naval Hospital. He had a son, George, who was my age, 16, and we became buddies. I looked him up again in 2012, and I asked him about what his dad had told him and his siblings about his role in the Kennedy case. That the only thing that he would say was that he couldn't understand why the Warren Commission never asked him to testify. Dr. Berkeley knew perfectly well why he wasn't asked to testify before the Warren Commission. The reason he didn't say anything to his children, he didn't want them to know that he was intimately involved in the cover-up. Dr. Berkeley's death certificate makes the single bullet theory bogus. The way the Warren Commission dealt with it was they didn't publish the death certificate.
If the ARRB had been a criminal investigation, would you have granted Berkeley immunity for his testimony?
We should have redeposed Humes and Boswell after giving them immunity. And if Berkeley had still been around, he would have been another candidate because he was at the center of the photographic cover-up. By the way, George Berkeley was a rear admiral. He was promoted to vice admiral by Lyndon Johnson. So he promoted Berkeley to the highest possible rank, kept him on as military physician, and the last person to walk out of the White House with Lyndon Johnson the day he left office was George Berkeley.
Using the most precise medical terminology that you can use.
Okay, let's see. It was on the right rear, and he shifted the head a little bit to the left. lifted up the, well, kind of the matted area, the flap, and you could see the hole, and there was brain and spinal fluid dripping down out of it. And then I noticed it was dripping, you know, down into a bucket.
In addition to this large avulsion of wound in the rear of the skull, 7 personnel at Parkland Hospital saw cerebellum at the bottom of the skull.
The brain consists of 2 large cerebral hemispheres, and then lower down, posteriorly, are 2 hemispheres, the cerebellum. They differ in coloration, they differ in the topographical markings.
So 7 doctors at Parkland Hospital claimed to have seen cerebellum.
In 1963, it was one of the top trauma centers in the country, and it's still one of the top trauma centers. Dr. Robert McClellan saw a clump of the cerebellum, a large clump, fall out of the skull onto the emergency room bed.
In my mind, as sure as you can ever be about any observation, that was cerebellum that extruded onto the gurney while I was standing there looking at it.
Then we have Dr. Kemp Clark. He went into detail with the Warren Commission about the result of all this loss of cerebellar tissue if President Kennedy had survived the wound. So there was no doubt that there was loss of cerebellar tissue.
This reliable eyewitness testimony indicates that the wound in Kennedy's rear skull extended quite low, and also there was severe damage to that sector of the brain. Yet in the autopsy report written at Bethesda by James Humes, there is no mention of the cerebellum, and he did not testify about it to the Warren Commission.
So these guys, good old Texan respected doctors, and they've seen hundreds and thousands of brains, especially the neurosurgeon, saw cerebellum having been damaged, significantly displaced in the occipital area. The doctors who did the autopsy read the autopsy report from Humes and Boswell. The cerebellum is intact. Who do you believe? Do you believe these Texas doctors, or do you believe the 2 career naval pathologists working under military control? Who do you believe as to whether or not the cerebellum was damaged?
There were many witnesses at Parkland and Bethesda who, in addition to seeing damaged cerebellum, also testified to seeing a severely damaged brain.
At Parkland, we have witnesses. One, Dr. Midget, saw brain matter sprayed all over the interior of the limousine.
Interestingly, the Secret Service washed out parts of the limo before shipping it to Washington, thus removing brain, blood, and tissue evidence from the crime scene.
Anybody that's seen the Zapruder film could see Kennedy's head explodes and debris flies all over the place. Jackie Kennedy climbed out onto the trunk of the limousine, picked up a chunk of the president's brain, had it with her, took it in and gave it to one of the doctors at Parkland Hospital.
And then we have Dr. McClellan talking about the large clump of the cerebellum that fell out onto the emergency room bed.
And when you look at the autopsy photographs of the brain, which I've seen the originals of, you can just see that the brain is disrupted, but very little of the tissue is missing. Then we look at the autopsy report of the brain, what they call the supplemental brain examination. The brain and evidence that's weighed there weighs 1,500 grams.
1,500 grams is above average weight of an adult male brain. There was one report of 8,000 autopsies, and the average weight of an adult male brain was 1,336 grams. So they're saying that President Kennedy's brain was well above the average weight.
Where did all that brain tissue disappear to that flies around Dealey Plaza, that Jackie has in her hand, that everybody's picking off of their clothes?
And FBI agent Frank O'Neill told the review board that over half of the mass of the brain was missing. He saw the brain removed at the autopsy. A lot of the mass missing was in the back. That's what mortician Tom Robinson said.
So it's impossible for the actual weight of President Kennedy's brain to be 1,500 grams. This is just one more reason why this cannot be President Kennedy's brain, the photographs that we have stored at the archives.
What's the purpose of sectioning a brain, and how is it done?
When a brain is to be examined in detail, you don't do it in the fresh state. A fresh brain has the consistency of a well-done soft-boiled egg. I don't mean to be crude, but this is the best metaphor I can think of. You fix it in formalin, in 2 weeks, the consistency becomes that of a hard-boiled egg. And now, think of slicing a hard-boiled egg. They say, and look at the Warren Commission report, look at the autopsy report, it says serial sections, parallel sections of the brain are not made in order to preserve the specimen. Preserve the specimen for whom? For Jacqueline Kennedy's mantelpiece? For the president's grandchildren? For a museum? Preserve it for whom?
Without sectioning the brain, there was no way for them to properly trace the trajectory of the wounds.
The review board had a consultant, a renowned forensic pathologist. He looked at the brain photographs and he said, this is a very well-fixed brain. It's all gray, it's not pink at all. It's been fixed for 2 or 3 weeks in formaldehyde. It's been fixed at least 2 weeks, maybe as long as 3 weeks. I looked at Jeremy Gunn and he looked at me and the hair stood up on the back of my neck because I knew that JFK's brain was examined less than 3 days after he was killed.
One can only imagine that they wanted the damage to the brain to be consistent with the hypothesis that Oswald had done the shooting. So if you had a defect going all the way to the back of the head, like so many witnesses testified to it, it might raise questions about whether that huge defect could have been caused by a single shot to the head, as Oswald is supposed to have done.
There are 2 photographs of the brain at the archives. I viewed those in 2015. The brain looked to me to be distorted. My first thought was that the brain had been sitting in a jar of formaldehyde for a long time. At a teaching hospital, there was no shortage of brains. Autopsies were very frequent. Frequently, the brain was saved for teaching medical students. So it would not have been difficult to find a replacement for these photographs.
Dr. Humes destroyed his original autopsy notes. Now, Dr. Humes is the chief autopsy pathologist, and what we all know as doctors, notes taken while you're doing something are much more important and are likely to be closer to the truth than anything you write later. And he admitted that he destroyed autopsy notes.
You destroy your original notes in a medical legal autopsy, and remember, that night, Oswald is still alive. You're going to be asked, doctor, at some point in time, under oath, to give sworn testimony. Why did you destroy those notes? Doctor, doesn't a pathologist keep his notes?
And he said, well, I destroyed my own autopsy notes because they were splattered with the president's blood, and I didn't want them to become objects of morbid curiosity. The third doctor, Dr. Fink, who was there, also wrote some notes and complained bitterly about the fact that his notes disappeared too.
He was so upset because he had to go home and reconstruct all of his notes from memory.
Today, after almost 60 years, due to an incomplete and questionable autopsy, no one can say for sure what happened. A riddle, like the Sphinx. The complete set of autopsy and brain examination photographs are housed at the National Archives, but are only available to congressional researchers and those experts authorized by the Kennedy family.
Who was the autopsy photographer?
John Stringer. He was a Navy civilian. He was widely respected. He had written a textbook on medical photography for the Navy, so he was the photographer of record. He photographed the autopsy itself and also photographed the president's brain 3 days later.
So the brain autopsy, or autopsies, there were probably 2 such events, occurred later and were not done on November 22nd. John Stringer reports that he was present at the brain autopsy, which apparently occurred on the Monday after, which would have been November 25th.
We were very careful to question Mr. Stringer at the very beginning of his deposition about all the photographs he took and ask him what kind of film he used for black and white, what kind of film he used for color. Jeremy Gunn showed Stringer the color positive transparencies of the brain, and Stringer immediately noted, well, these aren't Kodak, these might be Ansco also. He said, I don't see the name of the manufacturer on here, but he said, these might be Ansco. He says, but these don't have the right notches in the corner. So Jeremy Gunn said, did you use this film with these notches in it when you shot the brain? And he says, not as far as I know. Half of the brain photos are taken of a brain from above, superior views, which is what Stringer said he shot of the complete organ. But the other half of the brain photos in the archives are taken of the bottom, called basilar views. Did you take basilar views? The Stringer said, no, not as far as I know.
He testified to, as did two of the autopsy pathologists, that they took photographs of Jack Kennedy's head by peeling back the skull to demonstrate the entrance wound in the back of the skull, both from the inside of the skull and the outside of the skull. There are no such photographs in the file.
What we have here is evidence that impugns the authenticity of the brain photographs in the National Archives. If there was a trial today, these brain photographs would not be admissible as evidence.
Doesn't this all lead to the question, if Stringer did not take these photographs, then who did? Robert Knudsen was one of the most fascinating stories that the review board encountered. Knudsen was a Navy photographer who was detailed to the White House in 1958. If you read his obituaries in the New York Times and the Washington Post, you will see that he is credited with photographing Kennedy's autopsy. Except officially, he was not.
Robert Knudsen was not interviewed by the Warren Commission. So they finally found Robert Knudsen in 1978. And to its credit, the House Select Committee did a deposition of him. To their discredit, they never published it. They buried it for 50 years. And it got released in 1993. And I know why they buried it, because everything he told them about autopsy photography contradicted what they thought they knew in the official record.
What did Knudsen tell them?
So he says, Berkeley had me develop these black and white negatives on Saturday, November 23rd. And that's when I saw photographs of probes in the body. Well, they didn't like that. They really didn't know whether to believe him or not, because there are no pictures of probes in the body in the official collection. But he was sure that he developed those negatives and saw them.
He has never said he took photographs of the brain, but he implies that he was very busy taking photographs of the body. His wife was interviewed later by the Assassination Records Review Board. He told her that the photographs had been burned deliberately by the Secret Service, and that one photograph in particular, presumably the back of the head, had been severely altered. Gloria Knudsen was so disturbed by this after his death in 1989 that she actually contacted some of his colleagues there in the Navy, and they assured her that this was what he had told them too. In fact, he had told them that he had seen photographs of the back of JFK's head that showed a large wound low in the back of the head.
Stringer is still the autopsy photographer of record. I think they both took pictures. And I personally think that many of John Stringer's pictures never made it into the official collection, and a lot of the ones we're looking at are Robert Knudsen's pictures.
Sandra Spencer worked at the Anacostia facility, the Naval Photographic Center, which was quite separate from the Bethesda lab. And that weekend, she received film from both James Fox and the Secret Service and from Robert Knudsen.
The photographs that Sandra Spencer developed, which never made it into the official record. The only evidence we have of them is her testimony. Sandra Spencer was visibly upset when she looked at the official autopsy photographs. She started to cry.
In front of the review board?
Yes, she started to cry in front of Jeremy and I and the person from the archives, because she said, I developed pictures of him and his family for almost 3 years, and he never looked like this. And she said, he did not look this bad in the photographs I developed on Sunday. She said, he looks terrible in these photographs. He's all beat up. There's blood everywhere. There's open body cavities. She said there were no open body cavities. He was very cleaned up. It was very respectful. And in one of the photographs she developed, there was a brain, an intact brain, sitting next to the body, the nude body of the president. Strange, first of all, that it's intact, because we know from FBI agent Frank O'Neill that the brain was more than half missing when they removed it from the cranium.
Jeremy Gunn once made a comment. He said it's as if the autopsy materials were designed to hide what was really happening, as opposed to what they should usually do. They're supposed to reveal the full extent of things.
On November 1st, 1966, the National Archives and an official from the Department of Justice met with Humes, Boswell, photographer John Stringer, and the radiologist Ebersol. And they looked at the autopsy photographs for the first time. And they created a catalog, an inventory, simply saying, this is what this picture describes. During this discussion, the DOJ witness, Mr. Belcher, who was an attorney, noted they were discussing missing photographs. Jeremy Gunn, my boss, the general counsel, did ask why these people signed an inventory which they knew not to be true. And Stringer said, well, some people do object, but they don't last very long.
An inventory of autopsy materials submitted in 1965 to the National Archives listed microscopic tissue slides in a stainless steel container containing gross material, presumably the brain.
In August of '72, I'm there at the National Archives, and I'm looking. I have the executive agreement of April '65, and I have the inventory of October '66, a year and a half later. In addition to some x-rays and some photos that are missing, there's a large metal box that obviously contained the brain. Listed in '65, no longer listed in '66. Goodbye, brain.
And the tissue slides that they'd taken have disappeared from evidence. And people say, well, what difference do the tissue slides make? I'll tell you what evidence they make. When you do a little biopsy of that tissue around there, you can tell whether the bullet entered there or exited there by whether you find dust particles from the lead.
You don't have the brain. This is the heart, no pun intended, of the defendant's case. Mr. Prosecutor, you don't have the brain, you're out of here. And as we sit and talk here today, all these years later, that brain remains missing.
I'd hate to be in your shoes today. You have a lot to think about. You've seen much hidden evidence the American public has never seen. You know, going back to when we were children, I think that most of us in this courtroom thought that justice came into being automatically, that virtue was its own reward, that good would triumph over evil. But as we get older, we know this just isn't true. Individual human beings have to create justice, and this is not easy, because the truth often poses a threat to power, and one often has to fight power at great risk to themselves.
After the film JFK was released, several doctors went to the National Archives to view the x-rays of Kennedy's skull. They saw details in these x-rays which presented yet another problem for the Warren report's claim that Kennedy was only shot from the rear.
Well, the government investigations did claim that there was no evidence of a shot from the front. But they didn't tell us a few things that were very important, which we have learned only in recent years. We have seen tiny metal fragments right at the forehead.
When you look at the x-rays that are stored at the archives now, on the lateral x-ray, there's a fragment trail. It actually expands from front to back, and there are dozens of very tiny dust-like fragment particles up in this location.
Now, why is that important? Well, what we know is that the larger bullet fragments travel farther, whereas the smaller ones tend to stay near the entry site. That's what we see on these x-rays. In other words, we can reasonably interpret these as being consistent with a frontal bullet, but being radically inconsistent with a posterior bullet.
And that's not evidence you can erase. You can't make that disappear. That's incontrovertible evidence of a shot from the right front by a non-jacketed bullet.
This new X-ray evidence, combined with the review board's declassification of 40 witnesses who saw a hole in the back of Kennedy's head, constitutes powerful evidence of a shot from the front. Because 3 shells were found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, the Warren Commission was limited to only 3 shots. But one of the problems with CE-399, as Joseph Dolce said, was its nearly pristine condition, especially when compared with bullets the commission tested.
No, it could not have caused all the wounds, because our experiments have showed beyond any doubt that merely shooting the wrist deformed the bullet drastically.
As it turns out, there was an extra bullet, and it was misshapen. After the assassination, the motorcade raced to Parkland Hospital, where the emergency room doctors tried to save the president's life. After he was pronounced dead, Kennedy's personal physician, George Berkeley, got in contact with his assistant, James Young, in the White House and told him to prepare for the autopsy.
It was James Young who ordered Chiefs Mills and Martinell, their assistants, to go to the White House and retrieve what they knew were skull fragments in the limousine at that time.
The presidential limousine, while en route to Washington, was inspected, and a 3-inch triangular piece of bone was discovered on the floor near the rear jump seat. During the autopsy, Young sent his 2 assistants to meet the limo when it arrived at the White House garage.
And they brought back an additional envelope with the bullet with the bent tip. He described a bullet, brass-colored, about 5 millimeters in diameter.
As part of a naval oral history project, Jan Herman, who had interviewed Dr. Young on this subject, got in touch with Thomas Mills, one of the 2 men who had gone to the limo to retrieve the skull fragments.
Jan Herman called up Mills, says, "Hey, do you remember Dr. Young calling you, asking you about this bent bullet?" He says, "Yeah, I remember that, him calling me, and he remembered it." He says, "Can you shed any light on it?" And he says, "I would rather not talk about that."
You know what happened to this bullet?
It went from Mills and Martinell to Young to Humes. It disappears. That evening, there may have been as little as 4 people who saw that bullet before it disappeared.
The reports of this extra bullet substantiate some researchers' claim that there was a 4th shot hitting the limo at Zapruder frame 328.
The bullet itself is important, but what's more important is when it struck and where it came from. And previously at 313, when the bullet went forward through JFK's head, a small fragment had cracked the windshield from the inner surface. Later, the final shot was at 328 is when it struck. Both times there were flares of reflected light as the glass was deformed from the impacts, 1 of a fragment and 2 of a whole bullet. And these 2 events occurred in 0.9 seconds. So therefore, they couldn't have been shot from the same rifle.
The Warren Commission's contention is that only 3 shots were fired and that 1 of them had missed its target completely. So how does one account for the extensive damage to the limousine?
There is a lot of damage in the car. The chrome strip, which went around the windshield, was dented from the inside, which suggests a projectile from the rear. 6 witnesses reported a through-and-through hole in the windshield.
After the Secret Service tried to scrub down the interior at Parkland Hospital, the presidential limo was then flown to Washington. The interior was completely cleaned up within 36 hours, and the windshield was replaced within 48 to 72 hours. The car was then shipped first to the Ford factory in Michigan and then to Cincinnati, where it was extensively rebuilt by a car restoration company. At the trial of New Orleans businessman Clay Shaw, autopsy doctor Pierre Fink shockingly revealed that the wound in Kennedy's back was not dissected because an Army general ordered them not to. The failure to perform that standard practice led to a long trail of folly and error, assessing and locating this wound. Did the bullet perforate the body? Did it connect with the neck wound? Or was it perhaps made by a piece of shrapnel from the pavement in Dealey Plaza, creating a shallow wound with no exit?
The face sheet for the autopsy, where it shows the front and back silhouette of the body where you mark scars and bullet wounds and things. The face sheet showed the bullet wound in the back at the level of thoracic vertebra T3, which is 5.5 to 6 inches below, exactly where Dr. Berkeley had it in the death certificate.
That location coincided with what the 2 FBI agents wrote in their report. Both Seibert and O'Neill disagreed with the Warren report's depiction of both the rear skull wound and the back wound when the review board showed them the pictures in 1997. This is what Seibert had to say about the drawings commissioned by Arlen Specter. "What a liar. I feel he got his orders from above. How far above, I don't know. They got that single bullet theory by moving that back wound up to the base of the neck. The single bullet theory evolved over time and began with a problem the doctors had with the autopsy, finding an exit point for the back wound, and ending when Arlen Specter decided the bullet needed to hit 2 victims.
Darrell Tomlinson, a maintenance man at Parkland Hospital, passing by the ER, found the stretchers blocking the way, bent down, moved the stretcher, and there was a bullet. Keep in mind, it really is a magic bullet, because on the night of the autopsy, Friday, November 22nd, 1963, Humes and Boswell, these 2 military pathologists, they missed a bullet hole in the front of the president's neck. The night of the autopsy, they saw a tracheostomy. Indeed, there was a tracheostomy. The doctors at Parkland Hospital earlier that day had determined that the bullet had fortuitously ripped through the trachea. So they enlarged that bullet hole. Let me finish on Friday night. What to do? Hey, we got a bullet hole in the president's back, which they examined with a finger, then with an instrument, then took x-rays, then took out the lungs. No bullets. God, I wish I were there to see them sweating and have their underwear staining. Well, just like it's a work of fiction. A call came in from the FBI in Dallas to the FBI in D.C. A bullet was found. Now we know. When the president lay on the stretcher, supine position, and pressure was applied to his chest for cardiopulmonary resuscitation, that pressure applied anteriorly forced a bullet which had gone deeply into the tissues back out through, like a tunnel, in and out, a car in reverse. Bullets don't work that way. When a bullet goes in, it produces damage. The bullet becomes encased. Bullets don't go in and out like that. But that was their conclusion. It wasn't until the next morning when Humes decided, hey, maybe we ought to talk with the surgeons at Parkland Hospital. And now they learned for the first time that there was a tracheostomy superimposed upon a bullet wound. So now, as of Saturday, November 23rd, that magic bullet is from the front of the clothing. Bullet going through 6-7 inches of soft tissue, comes out, sees the starch white collar, gets frightened to death, plops into the front of his clothing, and that's where the bullet came from, found by Tomlinson at the hospital. 4 or 5 months later, under Arlen Specter's single bullet theory, that bullet has been rejuvenated, it's been revitalized. That bullet has now gone through Kennedy, through Connolly, piercing the lung, destroying 4 inches of the right fifth rib, exiting from the front of his chest, going into the back of the wrist, shattering the distal end of the radius, and a 6'4" guy like Connolly, that's a big, heavy bone, comminuted fracture, exits from the front of the wrist, goes into the left thigh, and now, as of April of 1964, the stretcher bullet, Commission Exhibit 399, the hero of the Warren Commission report, is now from Connolly's left thigh. Whatever you want, whatever you need, this bullet happily and readily obliges you. It is indeed a magic bullet.
And in order to make the facts fit the theory of one bullet doing all this damage, the Warren Commission needed to raise the wound in the back so that it would align with the alleged exit wound in the front of Kennedy's neck. Commissioner Gerald Ford did this simply via the stroke of a pen, changing the description in their report from back to back of the neck.
As I recall, they said about Gerald Ford that he could not chew gum and walk at the same time. Now, all of a sudden, he becomes a forensic pathologist and a photographer and a criminalist and an expert, and he knows where the bullet hole was, and he moved it up.
But then, in 1979, the House Select Committee moved it lower in the back because they had pictures from the autopsy. It is conceivable that at the time, the Warren Commission thought no one would ever see the autopsy photos. When the review board declassified the notation showing what Ford had done, the former commissioner replied that it had nothing to do with the conspiracy theory. He was only trying to be more precise. This is directly contradicted by a conversation Ford had with French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. According to d'Estaing, Ford told him the assassination was not the work of one person. It was something set up. We were sure it was set up, but we were not able to discover by whom.
Kennedy and his wife have a 2-year-old daughter, Caroline, and Mrs. Kennedy is currently expecting the birth of a second child. For his running mate in 1960, Kennedy chose Lyndon B. Johnson, leader of the Senate majority.
In the 1960 campaign, Kennedy had been advised by former Air Force Secretary Stuart Symington that military intelligence stated that the Russians had a significant advantage in long-range atomic missiles. He used the issue against Richard Nixon, even after he had been informed that it was inaccurate. When he got into office, he was told by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara that this was not only false, but America had a huge advantage. This led to a meeting in the summer of 1961. It included Kennedy, CIA Director Allen Dulles, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Lyman Lemnitzer. In 1993, the first official document describing the meeting was declassified. Dulles and Lemnitzer were advising Kennedy about the potential effects of a first-strike nuclear attack on the USSR, which would occur in the fall of 1963, a time when they predicted America would have its optimum advantage over Russian counter-strike capabilities. The advisors wanted to press that advantage to its ultimate nightmarish end.
You're talking about mass murder, General, not war.
Mr. President, I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed, but I do say no more than 10 to 20 million killed, tops, depending on the breaks.
I will not go down in history as the greatest mass murderer since Adolf Hitler.
Perhaps it might be better, Mr. President, if you were more concerned with the American people than with your image in the history books.
The importance of that meeting was that it showed that the strategic planners did in fact think of the military force that we were deploying at the time as a first strike force and not as a second strike retaliatory force. And the fact that this was the case was what I think tied Kennedy, Johnson, and McNamara together over this entire period, that they simply had to keep those missiles in their silos. Well, I called up Walt Rostow, who was a close friend and colleague by that time at the University of Texas. I said, Walt, I'm writing an article on a meeting of the National Security Council that took place on the 20th of July, 1961. And he looked at me without any further word. He said, you mean the one where they wanted to blow up the world?
After the meeting, Kennedy said to his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, and we call ourselves the human race. After his inauguration, Kennedy sent his aide Arthur Schlesinger on a tour of Latin America to come up with a plan to alter the Yankee gringo image of the United States in the region and also neutralize the appeal of communism. Kennedy organized a huge conference in Punta del Este, Uruguay, inviting representatives from Latin America to propose projects and to establish the Alliance for Progress.
For no real progress is possible unless the benefits of increased prosperity are shared by the people themselves.
Estas cosas deberían estar al alcance de todos y no limitarse a unos pocos afortunados.
They tried to create a program that would tie U.S. aid not to military control and authoritarian support of U.S. corporations, but rather to initiatives that would democratize the country and that would raise the poor out of poverty.
One of the least acknowledged aspects of Kennedy's foreign policy was his perspective regarding the Middle East. As part of an effort to bring balance to the region, Kennedy had concentrated on forging a relationship with Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt.
Kennedy's overall policy towards the Middle East had a few pillars. One was to take a more even-handed approach towards Israel and the Palestine issue than previous U.S. presidents had. A second issue was to support what he viewed as the progressive nationalist in places like Egypt, embodied by Nasser, and in Syria, as opposed to what Kennedy referred to as relics of the past, monarchies in places like Saudi Arabia or Jordan. Nasser was one of the foreign leaders that Kennedy had the most personal correspondence with. They sent over a dozen letters between each other. In those letters, Kennedy would disclose to Nasser some things that he was going to do in advance, like weapons sales to Israel. So Nasser really appreciated this communication.
Kennedy discerned that Nasser actually had
qualities that made him an appealing ally for the United States, that he actually could, through the right inducements, forge a partnership with Washington. It wouldn't be close, but if the United States was generous in its support of Egyptian development, Nasser might, as his ambassador promised, keep the Arab-Israeli conflict in the icebox. That was the phrase.
The United Nations had abandoned their plan to repatriate Palestinian refugees. Kennedy took it up as a cause with Israel. This would have allowed the refugees a choice of staying where they were, moving elsewhere, or relocating back to Israel, all at the UN's expense. The other problem Kennedy faced with Israel was the construction of the atomic reactor at Dimona. JFK was strongly against any proliferation of nuclear weaponry. He had been assured by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion that Dimona was designed for peaceful uses of atomic energy. In the spring of 1963, Kennedy demanded full inspections by the U.S. of the Dimona reactor and threatened to place American aid for Israel in limbo if no agreement were reached. And at the time of his assassination, negotiations were in process for biannual inspections. The existence of communism so close to American shores kept Cuba on Kennedy's plate. And in late 1961, he authorized covert efforts under the name Operation Mongoose. General Edward Lansdale ran the day-to-day operations of the project, but Robert Kennedy was above him to ensure it would not spin out of control as the Bay of Pigs had. The idea was to keep pressure on Castro so that he would not export communism further into Latin America and endanger the Alliance for Progress.
And despite later accusations of Kennedy's complicity in assassination plots, there is no known document that's emerged from the Mongoose files showing that he knew of any such attempts. This seems to be a remnant of the Eisenhower plan.
General Lansdale requests of the Joint Staff in February of '62, he requests that they come up with pretexts for a U.S. invasion of Cuba.
The following month, the Joint Chiefs of Staff presented a plan to Kennedy called Operation Northwoods, whereby the CIA would secretly perform terrorist acts in the United States and blame them on Castro to justify bombings and an invasion of Cuba. The president declined the recommendation.
And it takes only a few days before it's mano-a-mano, a face-to-face showdown between President Kennedy and General Lemnitzer. Lemnitzer says, we got a pretext, we can do this. Kennedy rebukes him.
Pretexts were outrageous. Fake an attack by Cubans against the Guantanamo Bay sentries. Sink a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame it on Cuba. The one that scares me the most was very sophisticated. Take an airliner and fly it as a drone over Cuba without any people in it, with a tape recording that would play, we're under attack by Cuban aircraft, oh my God, they're gonna kill us. Blow up the airplane, blow up this huge drone, and use that to start a war.
Within a matter of weeks, Lemnitzer says, well, to hell with the pretext, to hell with North, let's just invade anyway. And you see all these plans being sent to McNamara and to Kennedy from Lemnitzer that basically say, we got to go in. We just, never mind, who cares? There's no pretext, there's no rationale. We want to do it. President Kennedy has to fire Lemnitzer.
So the Northwoods plan was our big coup, our big find in the way of military records. They're universally recognized today for their importance, and it's one of those releases that the review board members, the board members themselves, were justifiably proud of, that came out of the JFK Records Act.
Throughout 1961, Kennedy rejected a total of 9 attempts by his military advisors to send American ground troops into Vietnam. And both General Douglas MacArthur and French President Charles de Gaulle strongly agreed with him about not doing so.
The issue of what to do in Cuba and the issue of what to do in Vietnam were inextricably intertwined, because you can't do all these things at once. We don't have enough soldiers. We don't have enough forces to do them. And it's not just Cuba and Vietnam. It's Cuba and Berlin and Laos and Vietnam. So Kennedy was most concerned, actually, about Berlin and was unwilling to put troops in Cuba because he would not be able to react if Khrushchev did something on Berlin. And Kennedy understood that. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff understood that. Now, with that as the context, when it comes to Vietnam, Kennedy tells Lyman Lemnitzer, look, if we're not going to go into Cuba, what in the hell are we going to go into Vietnam for?
Near the end of his first year in office, Kennedy received a report from Walt Rostow and General Maxwell Taylor, his foreign policy and military advisors, that called for increased training of South Vietnamese troops, increased bombings of the North, and use of U.S. combat troops.
At meetings later in November, I believe the 15th of November, National Security Council meeting, where this was thrashed out, Robert Kennedy was very explicit in saying, no, we're not sending combat troops. And it was clear from that point forward that this was the red line that John F. Kennedy would not cross.
A third influence on Kennedy's reluctance to commit American ground troops was his ambassador to India, John Kenneth Galbraith.
My father went to see Walt Rostow. He went in to talk to him. Rostow gestured on his desk to the pile of papers. The report, the Rostow-Taylor report, was plainly visible. My father asked to see it. Walt said, in effect, that his security classification wasn't sufficiently high. My father did not think that Walt Rostow's security classification was higher than his. And at a given moment, the phone rang. Walt turned to answer the phone, and Dad picked up the report and walked out of the office and read it. So from that point forward, he had an inside track on what was being, at that time, very closely held recommendation for a very strong combat intervention in Vietnam. And of course, he proceeded to counter it as best he could with direct advice to the president.
It isn't until later in that month where the Vietnam decision is finally arrived at, which is NSAM 111, where Kennedy says no combat troops, but will increase the advisors. And that was his signal decision in the Kennedy presidency, without respect to the withdrawal, but never to cross that line.
In October 1962, U-2 surveillance flights detected Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles off the U.S. coast. To this day, scholars debate Khrushchev's motivation. Was it because he feared a U.S. invasion of Cuba? Was it because of American missiles in Turkey? Was it, as Kennedy believed, a negotiating tool over Berlin? Despite pressure from his military advisors, Kennedy chose the least provocative alternative.
I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. First, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
Kennedy's military advisors, led by Air Force General Curtis LeMay, considered his refusal to attack as pure folly, the equivalent of surrender.
This is almost as bad as the easement of building.
A reference to Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain and the appeasement of the Nazis in 1938, which eventually led to World War II. As the crisis progressed into its second week, a U-2 plane was shot down, and Kennedy's civilian advisors began to side with LeMay, who wanted Kennedy to bomb the missile silos and invade the island. They did not know that the Cubans had short-range tactical nuclear missiles in place.
That was a pretty bad fix, President. Pretty bad? Pretty bad fix.
Kennedy had his brother meet with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin. According to the Soviets, Robert Kennedy warned that his brother was uncertain he could control the military much longer, and that a deal could be struck along the lines Khrushchev had suggested: a no-invasion pledge and a withdrawal of American missiles from Turkey. Most Americans felt elated over the end of the crisis, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff and LeMay felt that they had been defeated by the Soviets and denied the opportunity to topple Castro. Kennedy looked at it differently. He said, if we followed the Pentagon's advice, nobody would be around to tell the generals they were wrong.
The main, I think, goal of the Kennedy administration is how to, working around the State Department, working around the CIA, working around the Pentagon, how can the Kennedy White House pursue its own policy of peace with the rest of the world, with Castro in Cuba, with Khrushchev in Moscow, and so on, and avoid the horrendous mistakes of the past that almost got us into nuclear war.
In the midst of these debates, Kennedy sent Galbraith to Saigon to write a report that would differ in its recommendations from what Taylor and Rostow had given to him.
Kennedy knew what he wanted, and he knew what my father would deliver, which he did, which was a very detailed and skeptical report about the efficiency of the South Vietnamese government, about the capacity of any military force to prevail in the security situation that existed in South Vietnam at that time.
Kennedy told Galbraith to deliver his report to Defense Secretary McNamara, and he, in turn, gave instructions to begin the withdrawal to General Harkins, the commanding general of all forces in Vietnam. The Pentagon dragged its feet on formulating plans, and McNamara called for a meeting in May of 1963. One of the most important finds of the review board are the notes from this meeting.
McNamara said, "It's not fast enough. I want you to accelerate it." He says, "I want to pull out 1,000 men in December by the end of the year, and I want you to pull out complete units, not just individuals," because he didn't want it to be an accounting exercise of pulling out, delaying other individuals coming in and saying, "We pulled out 1,000 men." He wanted units to come out, full units.
After the withdrawal plan was approved, Kennedy sent Secretary of Defense McNamara and General Taylor to Saigon in September of '63. He planned on using their report as the basis to formally order the withdrawal to begin. Kennedy controlled the report, since it was actually being written under the supervision of Bobby Kennedy. But still, men like Undersecretary of State William Sullivan and Taylor tried to remove the recommendation for withdrawal. Kennedy insisted that it stay in.
Then Kennedy takes that secretly, 3 days later, actually issues the order himself at the secret level. And it doesn't become an NSAM yet. It should, but once it leaks out into the newspapers, his opponents find out what he's done, then it's in the newspapers, and McGeorge Bundy says to Kennedy, "Hey, look, if they're talking about it in the newspapers, we might as well put it on paper." And they put it, and it was NSAM 263. And that's how it was actually written and why. Well, here's one of the things McNamara said in the secret debrief. He said, "We had agreed, the president and I, that we had trained them, we had given them everything we could, and if they couldn't win, too bad. We had to get out, even if they were going to be defeated." So he and Kennedy, McNamara and Kennedy, had decided that they were willing to pull out of Vietnam in a losing scenario. That's very important.
Can you tell us about the Air Force One tapes and General Curtis LeMay?
On the new version of the Air Force One tapes, the Clifton tapes, it's revealed that Colonel Dorman, General LeMay's aide, was desperately trying to contact LeMay on the radio.
Colonel Dorman, General LeMay's aide.
Right.
General LeMay is in a C-140. Last three numbers are 497. He's inbound. His code name is Grandson, and I want to talk to him.
A logbook was recovered by the ARRB from the Air Force Command Post at Andrews, and it was given to us by a civil servant named Chuck Holmes. And this logbook records in-flight conversations between a command post at Andrews and Air Force One as it's flying from Texas back to Washington.
Air Force One, this is the Air Force Command Post. If possible, request the names of the passengers on board, please.
So this logbook shows that General LeMay, at the time of the assassination, was in Canada. This is really interesting because his official biographer says he was hunting in Michigan, but we know that's not true. He was in Toronto for reasons unknown. Without his aide, Colonel Dorman, who went with him everywhere, this logbook reveals that he was ordered by Secretary Zucker to land at Andrews Air Force Base because all the federal officials were going to meet the president's body at Andrews Air Force Base. A transmission was made from LeMay's plane back to this command post, and it says, General LeMay will not go to Andrews. General LeMay will go to DCA, National Airport. According to this log, his plane lands at 5:15 p.m., well before the autopsy started.
Very few people in the Pentagon had a worse relationship with Kennedy than Curtis LeMay. During the missile crisis, he opposed Kennedy's solution of a blockade. When Kennedy left the room after this conference, LeMay openly ridiculed him. LeMay was strongly against the test ban treaty Kennedy was working on and signed in 1963. He wanted to escalate the Vietnam War with both naval and air power by carrying the war north. He advocated bombing North Vietnam back to the Stone Age if need be, and was willing to use atomic weapons if the Chinese intervened.
There were a lot of people at the Bethesda morgue. The latest count by all the researchers that I know of is about 33 people. There was a gallery, bleachers. Apparently all 3 rows were filled with people. Both Dr. Humes has complained after the fact, and Tom Robinson, the mortician from Gawler's funeral home, they both equated it to a 3-ring circus.
But these 3 autopsy pathologists who were not really credentialed to do that kind of an autopsy were given a body, told, here's the body, he was shot from behind, he fell forward, which they wrote in their autopsy report, figure out how the wounds fit the known circumstances of the shooting. But what this really speaks to is the fact that the autopsy was not in the control of the surgeons that were charged with doing it. It was in the control of people who were there, who were telling them what they could do and what they couldn't do.
Paul O'Connor was a Navy corpsman helping the pathologists. He told me in 1999, he told others this in 1992, he's told several people that Dr. Humes, during the autopsy, complained that somebody was smoking a cigar. Tell him to put the damn thing out. So O'Connor, he went over to the gallery, the 3 rows of bleachers, and there was General LeMay sitting in his uniform with a big fat cigar in his hand, and LeMay looked at him after I asked him to put it out and promptly blew smoke in his face. Did LeMay go to the autopsy to gloat over the death of his nemesis?